Daniel walked slowly through the wide stone hall, his boots echoing against the polished floor. He had been called to the palace before, but never to the inner chamber where the queen herself waited. His heart beat hard in his chest as he thought of why he was chosen. He was only a soldier, not a noble or a court healer. Still, the message had been clear. The queen had been wounded, and she needed someone she could trust. The doors opened with a heavy sound, and Daniel stepped inside. Golden light from tall chandeliers lit the chamber. The walls were decorated with banners and paintings of past rulers, and the air smelled faintly of smoke and perfume. Guards in shining armor lined the room, their hands close to their swords. At the center, on a chair carved from dark wood and gold, sat Queen Evelyn. She was young, yet her presence filled the room with strength. Her gown shimmered in the light, though he could see the faint stain of blood near her shoulder. Daniel dropped to one knee out of respect. He could feel the eyes of every guard watching him, ready to strike if he made one wrong move. The queen lifted her hand and spoke softly, though her voice carried across the room. She told him to rise and come closer. His steps were slow but steady. He stopped when he was only a few feet away, close enough to see the pain in her face. The wound was on her back, hidden beneath layers of silk. A failed attack during a royal gathering had left her injured, and though the attacker had been caught, the cut remained. No court physician had been allowed to touch it, rumor said. The queen trusted no one near her at such a weak moment. Yet here Daniel stood, a simple soldier, chosen to treat her wound. He did not understand why, but he felt the weight of her trust settle on his shoulders. She turned slightly, and the guard shifted uneasily. One of them warned Daniel not to come too close. The queen silenced him with a glance, her green eyes sharp and unyielding. She gave Daniel a small nod. His hands trembled, but he steadied them. From the pouch he carried he drew clean cloth, a small flask of clear water, and strips of linen. He had used these many times on the battlefield, treating men who cried out in pain or fear. Now he would use them on the ruler of the empire. He stepped behind her chair, his eyes fixed on the wound. Carefully he pulled back the silk, exposing the cut across her shoulder blade. It was deep but clean, the kind of injury that needed careful hands. Daniel poured water over the cloth and began to clean the wound. The queen did not flinch, though. He saw her lips pressed tightly together. Her pale skin shone in the light, and the blood looked darker against it. He worked slowly, wiping away the dirt and blood until the cut was clear. Then he pressed a dry cloth to it, holding it firm. The chamber was silent except for his movements.
Ouch!
The guards watched with stiff posture, and even the queen's ladies-in-waiting stood frozen. Daniel wrapped the wound with linen, binding it firmly across her back. He tied the ends with steady hands, careful not to cause her more pain. When he stepped back, his breath was heavy, but his work was neat and strong. Queen Evelyn turned her head slightly, her eyes meeting his. For a moment, the world outside the chamber seemed to vanish. Her gaze held not only thanks but something deeper, something unspoken. Daniel bowed his head, unsure of what to say. He was just a soldier, yet he had done what no other was allowed to do. At last she spoke. Her voice was calm, but each word carried meaning. She told him that what he had done was something only a spouse could be trusted to do. The words rang in his ears and left him frozen. Round the chamber, the guards shifted in surprise, and whispers passed between the queen's attendants. Daniel did not move. He could not answer. He only stood there, feeling the weight of her words settle on his heart. The task was finished, but Daniel knew his life would never be the same again. He had touched the queen's wound, and she had given him a place no one else could claim. The chamber grew quiet once more, but inside Daniel's mind, a storm had begun. He was no longer only a soldier, he was now part of something greater, though he did not yet understand what it meant. Daniel left the queen's chamber with his mind racing. The words she had spoken stayed with him. Only a spouse could be trusted to treat her wound. He repeated it in his head as he walked the long halls, passing guards and servants who looked at him with quiet curiosity. They had seen what happened. They had heard her words. Whispers would spread quickly, and soon the whole palace would know. He was a soldier, loyal and ordinary. But after this moment, nothing felt ordinary anymore. The next morning, Daniel was called back to the palace. He expected to be questioned, or even punished. Instead, he was led once again into the queen's presence. Queen Evelyn sat tall on her throne, her gown brighter than before, her crown catching the light of the chandeliers. Her wound was bandaged and she looked stronger. When Daniel bowed, she raised her hand and told him to stand. Her voice was steady, but her eyes held a softness that only he seemed to notice. She asked him to remain close to the palace for the coming days. The wound needed care, and she wanted no one else to touch it. Daniel felt the eyes of the nobles and advisors around the room. Some frowned in disapproval, others hid their surprise. To them, he was no more than a common soldier, unfit to be trusted with the queen's life. But her word was final, and no one dared to speak against it. Later that day, Daniel was brought to her private chambers. The room was quiet, lit by tall windows that let in the morning sun. Rich carpets covered the floor, and golden frames lined the walls with paintings of rulers from the past. Queen Evelyn sat near the window, her back to him. She dismissed her attendants, leaving only Daniel in the room. The silence between them was heavy, but not unfriendly. She told him to check the wound, and he obeyed, careful and gentle as before. As he worked, she spoke. She asked about his life, where he had come from, and how he had survived the endless battles at the Empire's borders. Daniel answered honestly. He told her about his small village, about his parents who had worked the land, and about the day he left home to join the army. His voice was simple, without pride or shame. The queen listened with interest, her eyes steady on him. She seemed to find comfort in his plain words, words free of courtly games and polished lies. When he finished tending to her wound, she thanked him again. Her voice was quiet, but there was something in it that felt rare, something reserved only for him. Daniel bowed, unsure how to respond. He wanted to speak, but he feared his words would not be enough. The moment passed, and she turned back to her window, lost in thought. He left the chamber, yet her presence stayed with him. Outside, the palace was alive with whispers. Servants carried stories through the halls, and nobles gathered in corners, speaking in hushed voices. Some claimed the queen had chosen Daniel for reasons beyond loyalty. Others said it was a mistake that would weaken her rule. But among the soldiers, there was quiet pride. Daniel was one of them, and he had been trusted above all others. The following evening, the queen invited Daniel to join her in the council chamber. The hall was filled with lords, generals, and advisors. Maps were spread across the long table, and candles burned low as they discussed threats beyond the Empire's borders. Daniel stood at the side, silent at first.
Ow.
Then, to his surprise, the queen asked for his opinion. The room fell silent as every eye turned to him. He spoke carefully, giving his thoughts on the strategies he had seen fail in battle and the ones that had worked. His words were not polished, but they were honest and clear. The queen listened closely, nodding at his points. Some lords scoffed, but others admitted his words held truth. When the council ended, the queen thanked him before them all. That single gesture carried weight greater than gold. Daniel felt the power of it, though he did not seek power. He sought only to serve with honor, yet now his role had shifted. He was no longer just a soldier standing at the edge of the room. He was the man trusted by the queen herself. That night, Daniel lay awake in his quarters, staring at the ceiling. He thought of the queen's words, her trust, and her steady gaze. He thought of the way her voice softened when she spoke to him alone. The Empire was changing, and he was caught in the center of it. Did not know what path lay ahead, but he knew one truth. Whatever storms came, he would not turn away from the bond that had been placed upon him. Daniel walked through the palace gardens in the early morning. The air was cool, and the sound of water running from a stone fountain filled the space. He needed the quiet to gather his thoughts. The queen's words still echoed in his mind. She had said only a spouse could treat her wound in such a way. Those words had not left him, and he knew they had not left the nobles either. Whispers followed him wherever he went. Some said he had stolen a place that was never meant for him. Others said he was chosen by fate. Daniel tried to push it aside, but the truth was that everything in his life had changed. When he was called again to the queen's chamber, he entered with steady steps. Queen Evelyn stood by a tall mirror, her gown flowing around her, the crown resting on her pale hair. She dismissed her attendants, leaving only him. Daniel noticed she was standing taller, her strength returning. She asked him to check the wound once more. He obeyed, unwrapping the bandages and studying the mark across her back. The cut was healing well under his care. He replaced the bandages gently, his hands careful not to cause her pain. As he worked, she began to speak. She told him that trust was rare in the palace. Every smile could hide a dagger. Every word could be twisted. She said that the moment he treated her wound, he had shown her something no one else had given her. She did not call it loyalty or duty. She called it truth. Daniel listened, unsure how to answer. He was only a soldier, yet the queen spoke to him as if he was her equal. When she turned to face him, her green eyes seemed to look deeper than ever before. That day, she invited him to walk with her in the gardens. The guards followed at a distance, but they stayed far enough to give space. The queen and Daniel walked side by side among the roses and marble statues. She asked him about life in the army. He told her about nights under the open sky, about comrades who had fallen, and about victories that had cost more than they gave. She listened without judgment, her face calm, but her eyes full of thought. For the first time, Daniel felt like she wanted to know him, not just use him for his skills. Later, at a royal gathering, nobles from across the empire filled the grand hall. Music played, and chandeliers lit the room with golden fire. Daniel stood near the wall with other soldiers, watching over the guests, yet his eyes often found the queen. She moved with grace among the lords and ladies, her crown shining brighter than all the jewels in the room. But then something unexpected happened. A noble questioned her decision to keep Daniel so close, said it was unwise to give a soldier such a place of honor. The hall grew quiet as everyone waited for her answer. Queen Evelyn raised her hand and spoke with calm strength. She said Daniel had proven his worth not with titles or wealth, but with courage and honesty. She said he had touched her wound and shown her trust, and that no noble trick could ever compare. The noble bowed his head, silenced, but the whispers in the hall only grew louder. Some looked at Daniel with envy, others with anger, yet the queen's words had marked him before all. That night, when the hall was empty, Daniel returned to his quarters. He sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the floor. He had never sought this, had never dreamed of being close to the queen. Yet now, every step he took seemed to lead him deeper into her world. He thought of her words, of the way she looked at him, and of the bond that grew stronger each day. He felt the weight of responsibility pressing on him, heavier than any armor he had worn. The days passed and their bond grew more visible. She called for him often, not just to tend to her wound, but to speak with him, to ask his counsel, and to walk beside her. The palace had begun to change. Some guards saluted him with respect. Some servants bowed lower than before, but danger also grew. Daniel could feel the tension in the air. The nobles would not sit quietly while a soldier gained the queen's trust. Shadows moved in the corners of the palace, and he knew that soon someone would test the strength of their bond. As he lay awake at night, Daniel promised himself one thing. Whatever came, he would stand beside her. Whether the nobles accepted it or not, whether the empire turned against him, he would not betray the trust she had given. For the queen had spoken words that could never be forgotten. And in his heart, Daniel knew those words were the beginning of a destiny he had never chosen, but one he could not walk away from. The palace grew restless in the days that followed. Daniel could feel it in the way the nobles watched him, their eyes sharp with suspicion. Servants carried whispers through the halls, and guards spoke in hushed tones when he passed. Yet through it all, Queen Evelyn remained steady. She continued to call for him, to ask for his counsel, and to trust him with matters no one else heard. Daniel knew that each day brought more danger, but he could not step back. The bond between him and the queen was now too strong to break. One afternoon, he was summoned to the council chamber. The air inside was tense. Nobles and generals stood around the great table, maps spread wide, argued about reports of enemies gathering beyond the borders. Voices rose and tempers flared. Daniel stayed silent at first, standing near the queen. When one general shouted that the empire was too weak to defend itself, Queen Evelyn raised her hand and silenced them all. Her voice was calm as she asked Daniel to speak. The room grew still. Daniel stepped forward, his eyes on the maps. He spoke plainly, describing what he had seen in battle. He explained how the enemy would strike, and how the empire could hold its ground with the right plan. His words were not dressed in fancy speech, but they were sharp with truth. Some nobles scoffed, but others leaned closer, realizing his experience was greater than their titles. The queen nodded, her gaze steady on him. When he finished, she declared that his advice would be followed. The council broke apart in a storm of whispers, but Daniel stood firm. He had spoken only what he knew, yet the queen's trust in him made it more powerful than the voices of all the nobles. As they left the chamber, she walked beside him. She told him that courage was not in crowns or gold, but in the truth spoken without fear. Daniel bowed his head, humbled by her words, but also strengthened by them. That evening, the queen invited him to join her for a quiet meal in her private hall. The long table was filled with food, but only the two of them sat there, the guards waiting at a distance. The glow of candles softened the room, and for a time they spoke not of war, but of their lives. She asked him again about his village, about the river he had fished as a boy, about the fields his parents had worked.
Oh.
Daniel answered simply, and she listened with a smile that reached her eyes. In return, she told him pieces of her own past. She spoke of the day she was crowned, of the weight of duty, and of the loneliness that came with power. Their words flowed easily, as if the walls of the palace had fallen away. For a moment, Daniel forgot he was only a soldier, and she was the queen. They were simply two people who had found trust in each other. When the meal ended, she stood and thanked him not just for his loyalty, but for his presence. Daniel bowed, but her words stayed with him long after he left. As the days passed, danger grew nearer. Reports of enemy movements reached the palace daily. The nobles argued endlessly, some demanding retreat, others calling for alliances. The queen stood firm, her strength unshaken, and Daniel remained at her side. Yet the threats were not only outside the empire. In the shadows of the palace, schemes took shape. Some nobles feared that Daniel's bond with the queen would change the order of power. They whispered of betrayal, of ways to remove him before he rose higher. One night, Daniel walked the outer halls alone, felt the chill of the stone walls and the weight of unseen eyes. A figure moved in the shadows, and he caught the glint of steel. Without thought, he turned, his hand gripping the arm of the attacker. The struggle was quick and silent, ending with the man fleeing into the darkness. Daniel stood, breathing hard, knowing this was only the beginning. His place beside the queen had made him a target. The next morning, he told Queen Evelyn of what had happened. She listened with calm resolve, her face pale, but her eyes fierce. She told him that as long as he stood with her, enemies would rise, both inside and outside the palace. She asked him if he was ready to bear that burden. Daniel looked at her and answered without hesitation. He told her he had already made his choice. Whatever came, he would not leave her side. The queen smiled then, not the smile of a ruler, but of a woman who had found someone she could truly trust. For Daniel, that moment was worth more than any crown. He knew the storms were gathering, but he also knew one truth. He was no longer just a soldier. He was the shield that stood between the queen and the world, and nothing would tear him away from her. The days of waiting ended when the empire's enemies finally marched to its borders. Messengers arrived breathless, their words carrying the weight of fear. A vast army was moving closer, larger than any seen in years. The council chamber filled with shouting voices. Nobles demanded retreat, generals argued about strategies, and fear spread like fire. Through it all, Queen Evelyn sat silent, her crown steady on her head, her eyes watching every man who spoke. When the noise reached its loudest point, she raised her hand and called for Daniel. Daniel stepped forward, his armor plain compared to the silk robes and jeweled cloaks around him. He bowed before the queen, but his eyes stayed firm. She asked him to speak, to give his counsel before them all. The chamber fell silent. Daniel spoke of the enemy's movements, of how they would strike, and of the courage of soldiers who were ready to fight. He told them that victory would not come from hiding behind walls, but from standing together as one. His words were simple, but they carried the strength of truth. The queen nodded and declared his plan would be followed. The decision shocked the nobles. Some whispered in anger, others in disbelief, but none could oppose her command. For the first time, Daniel was not just a soldier speaking in the shadows. He was the voice of the queen's will. That night, preparations began. Soldiers sharpened their blades, blacksmiths worked through the dark hours, and banners of the empire were raised high. Daniel moved among the men, speaking to them not as a noble, but as one of their own. His presence gave them hope, and his steady gaze reminded them that their queen believed in them. When dawn broke, the army gathered on the fields beyond the palace walls. The enemy banners appeared on the horizon, dark and endless. Fear stirred. But Daniel rode to the front, his sword at his side, his voice strong. He told the soldiers that they did not fight for gold or power, but for their home, their families, and their queen. His words echoed across the field, and the men lifted their swords high. Behind them, Queen Evelyn stood tall on the palace steps, her presence alone enough to steady the hearts of all who saw her. The battle that followed was fierce. Steel clashed, arrows filled the sky, and the ground shook with the weight of marching feet. Daniel fought at the front, his sword striking with skill and courage. He moved with the strength of a man who carried more than his own life on his shoulders. Every time he faltered, he thought of the queen's trust, and it drove him forward. Soldiers followed his lead, holding the line even when the enemy pressed hard. The field became a storm of noise and fire, but still they stood. Hours passed, and the sun burned hot above them. At last, Daniel saw the enemy begin to break. Their lines faltered, their courage fading as the Empire's soldiers pushed them back. With one final charge, the enemy retreated, leaving the field littered with the signs of battle. Cheers rose from the Empire's army, voices filled with relief and pride. Daniel lowered his sword, his chest heaving, his body weary, but his spirit strong. Victory had been won. When he returned to the palace, the people filled the streets, their voices crying the queen's name. They called her strong, they called her wise, but many also spoke Daniel's name. They knew he had stood beside her, that he had led them when others had faltered. In the grand hall, Queen Evelyn received him before the nobles and soldiers alike. She stood from her throne, walked to him, and placed her hand on his shoulder. She spoke clearly so all could hear. She said he had given more than loyalty. He had given his heart to the Empire and to her. The hall erupted in cheers, though not all voices joined. Some nobles bowed their heads with pride, others turned away in silent envy, but none could deny what had been done. The Empire had been saved, and Daniel was forever bound to its queen. In that moment, the bond between them was no longer hidden, was clear as the banners that hung above their heads. That night, when the palace grew quiet, Daniel stood once more in the gardens. The stars shone above him, the air cool after the fire of battle. Queen Evelyn joined him, her gown trailing softly over the grass. They spoke little, 4 words were no longer needed. Their bond had been tested in blood and fire, and it had endured. As they stood side by side beneath the night sky, Daniel knew the truth. He was no longer just a soldier, and she was no longer just a queen, standing alone. Together, they had become something greater, something unbreakable, a shield and crown bound by trust and destiny.